We've all been sold the Hollywood version of the Vikings, rugged warriors, epic battles, and glorious deaths that lead straight to Valhalla. But when the axes stopped swinging and the shield walls shattered, the real horror story began not for the men who died, but for the women who survived. For the wives and daughters of the defeated, the silence of the battlefield was just the prelude to a nightmare that made death look like a mercy. They weren't just prisoners of war, they were raw materials in a sophisticated, industrialized machine of human trafficking that turned women into livestock before the smoke had even cleared. The terror they faced wasn't accidental chaos. It was a calculated, state-sanctioned system of erasure that stripped them of their humanity the moment their husbands fell. This wasn't random pillaging by barbarians, this was law, written in blood and carved into stone. The Vikings didn't just steal gold, they harvested people with a terrifying efficiency that would make a modern corporation jealous. We are talking about a society where a woman's value was calculated down to the ounce of silver, where her body was a currency and her womb was a factory for the next generation of slaves. Forget the romantic myths of shield maidens and noble savages. The reality of the Viking Age was a grinding, brutal economy built on the bones of captured women. But how deep did this rabbit hole of horror go? To find the answer, we have to dig beneath the surface, literally into the mud of Dublin, where the earth itself is still screaming. When archaeologists excavated Wood Quay in Dublin, they didn't just find pottery and combs, they found the rusted shackles of a thriving slave market, iron cuffs sized for women's wrists and ankle rings small enough for children tell a story that the sagas tried to hide. Dublin wasn't just a trading post, it was a human warehouse where captured wives were sorted, graded, and stored like grain. The sheer scale of the infrastructure storage buildings capable of holding hundreds of humans proves that this was no side hustle. It was the beating heart of the Viking economy. In these markets, a woman's life was reduced to a price list that we can still read today, carved into stone markers in Schleswig. A young woman, 20 silver pieces. A mother, 15. A woman injured during capture, 10. It was a cold, hard calculus where trauma was just a depreciation of assets. Imagine standing on an auction block, listening to men haggle over your worth while the blood of your family is still drying on your clothes. But being sold was arguably the lucky outcome. For those who weren't deemed valuable enough for the market, the Vikings had a much darker, more ritualistic purpose in mind. In 862, the Vikings stormed the settlement of Port Mahomac, slaughtering 47 warriors. But the 53 women they seized weren't just killed, they were executed with a precision that suggests a terrifying ritual. Soil tests from nearby bogs revealed female bodies with patterned injuries, skulls fractured from behind, forearms shattered from defense. These weren't battle casualties. They were methodical executions carried out days after the raid. The consistency of the wounds suggests a cold, bureaucratic decision to cull the excess stock, treating human lives like surplus inventory to be liquidated. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Scandinavia, boat burials contained female skeletons with signs of strangulation and drug traces in their teeth. These women were drugged with henbane, dazed and hallucinating, before being sacrificed to accompany their dead masters to the afterlife. They were raped, strangled, and buried as grave goods, treated with no more dignity than a favorite horse or a prized sword. The Vikings believed that a warrior needed his possessions in the next life, and to them, a woman was just another possession. But for the women kept alive, the daily reality was a living hell that makes ritual sacrifice look almost peaceful. Norse war culture had strict laws regarding captured women. A slain warrior's wife became the lawful property of his killer, not as a servant, but as a forced wife. The Old Norse word was kona, which literally meant owned woman. This wasn't a marriage, it was legalized rape. The captor would declare ownership before witnesses, and suddenly, the assault was a legally binding union. The woman had no voice, no choice, and no escape. The law codified her rape as a legitimate marriage. and any children born from it were considered rightful heirs. The Graga's law codes were explicit. A claim had to be made within 3 days, or rivals could contest it. Women were fought over like prize cattle. If she tried to kill herself to escape, the captor could legally demand compensation from her family for theft of property. Suicide wasn't seen as a tragedy. It was seen as financial damage to the owner, a final insult to a woman's agency even in death. But what happened when these owned women dared to fight back? The Vikings had a special, slow-motion nightmare reserved for anyone who challenged their authority. In 914, when the Irish retook Dublin, they found punishment pits outside the city walls, stone-lined holes designed for a slow, agonizing death. Inside were skeletons with legs broken to prevent escape and arms shattered to prevent suicide. These women weren't killed quickly. They were kept alive to suffer. Crouched in agony in pits too shallow to stand and too small to lie down, they died of thirst and exposure while their captors watched, turning their torture into a public lesson. Viking law confirmed this brutality. Any slave woman who harmed her master was to be buried alive. But the decomposition layers in the soil show that this wasn't a quick burial. It was a drawn-out process where the victim was left to rot while still breathing. Some pits contained sharp stones to tear the flesh, while others held standing water to slowly drown the victim, ensuring that every moment of their final days was a masterpiece of pain. The cruelty was the point. It was a warning to every other captive. Submission is your only option. But as the Viking Age evolved, the system became even more industrialized, turning women into biological machines. By the mid-10th century, the Viking war machine had integrated slavery into its very logistics. After the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, the victors discovered portable breeding pens in the Viking baggage train. These weren't crude cages. They were engineered frameworks with iron fittings, designed to restrain humans during long marches. These mobile prisons allowed the army to carry their livestock with them, processing women on the go and ensuring a steady supply of slaves no matter where they campaigned. Each pen could hold a dozen adults or 20 children, with iron rings to anchor the chains. Wear patterns show they were used constantly. This wasn't occasional brutality, it was an organized system of mobile human trafficking. For the Vikings, war wasn't just about conquest, it was a harvest. And these pens were the threshing machines that separated the valuable humans from the waste. The infrastructure of slavery was woven into the daily life of every Viking settlement. But the most shocking revelation comes from a mass grave in Repton, where the Vikings turned their violence inward in a final, desperate act. In 986, as Viking power in England was collapsing, a mass grave was sealed at Repton containing 236 female bodies. But isotope analysis revealed a shocking twist. These weren't British captives. They were Norse-born women. These were the Vikings' own wives and daughters. Faced with defeat, the Viking men knew exactly what awaited captured women, because they had been inflicting it on others for centuries. They executed their own families to save them from the fate of slavery. Soil cores show the killings happened over several days, not a panicked massacre, but an organized extermination. Husbands killed wives, fathers killed daughters. It was a grim mirror of the terror they had unleashed on the world, a final admission that death was preferable to the life of a slave in the world they had built. Among the bones, one skull bore a runic inscription that chills the blood. I am better this way. Even in the midst of slaughter, someone needed to justify the horror, to believe that cutting a child's throat was an act of mercy. The Viking slave trade wasn't just a local affair, it was a global enterprise. Weekly ships left Dublin for the Islamic markets of the East, carrying pale-skinned women who fetched premium prices in Baghdad. Arabic chroniclers described these Viking slave caravans, noting the ruthless efficiency of the Rus traders. Women were treated as exotic luxury goods, shipped thousands of miles down the Russian rivers to be sold into harems, their lives becoming a currency that fueled the Viking economy. Maritime archaeology has uncovered purpose-built slave ships in the North Sea. These weren't modified cargo vessels. They had reinforced holds, ventilation shafts, and water stores designed for human cargo. One wreck from 912 could carry 80 captives below deck. When it went down, 80 chained women drowned in the darkness, their screams unheard beneath the waves, just collateral damage in a high-stakes business. But amidst this ocean of suffering, there were sparks of resistance. One woman, a former slave named Gunhild, decided that she wasn't going to be a victim, she was going to be a nightmare. In 923, Frankish records mention Gunhild, a freed Norse captive who turned the raiders' own tactics against them. She knew their methods, their weaknesses, and their fears. For 7 years, she led war bands across Frankish territories, hunting Vikings with a brutality that matched their own. She didn't just defeat them, she obliterated them, burning their camps and freeing hundreds of captives in a crusade of vengeance. Her methods were ruthless. Surprise attacks, no prisoners, no mercy. Her final recorded raid targeted the slave market at Rouen, where she systematically executed every trader she found. 47 Viking men died, castrated, and bled out a poetic justice for the men who traded in flesh. Gunhild vanishes from the records after 930, but the burn layers at Viking sites along the Seine tell us that for a brief, glorious moment, the hunters became the prey. Gunhild's story is a rare flicker of light in a dark history, but the system she fought didn't die with the Vikings. It evolved, shape-shifting into a new form under the Normans. When William the Conqueror took England in 1066, he didn't abolish the Viking slave system, he rebranded it. The Domesday Book lists women alongside cattle and plows as chattel. Norman castles contained holding cells designed specifically for women, with infant mortality rates close to 100%. The children born of rape were seen as liabilities, discarded like refuse in castle middens, while their mothers were kept as breeding stock for the new aristocracy. This was ethnic cleansing through sexual violence. Saxon women were systematically captured and forced to marry Norman knights to civilize the bloodline. Marriage became the legal framework that turned rape into legitimacy. It was a transfer of property where the woman's body was the deed to the land, her consent irrelevant in the grand scheme of Norman conquest. Church records tell of the desperation. Suicide rates among noble women soared, and the number of nuns tripled as women fled to convents to escape forced marriage. But the most damning evidence is written in our DNA. Genetic studies of modern populations reveal the scale of this industrial rape. In Iceland today, 60% of female ancestry traces back to Celtic women, while in Norway, it's about 40%. These weren't voluntary migrations. They were the genetic footprint of centuries of abduction. Every one of those percentages represents a woman dragged from her home, forced into a ship, and raped until she bore the children of her captors. This wasn't cultural exchange, it was mass kidnapping. Mitochondrial DNA doesn't lie. It tells a story of millions of women whose lives were stolen, whose names were forgotten, but whose blood still runs in the veins of Scandinavia.